Hello and welcome to the presentation on Chapter 3 of the International Levee Handbook. My name is Jamie McVicker. I am the Levee Safety Program Manager for the St. Louis District Office of the Corps of Engineers and co-author for Chapter 3 of the International Levee Handbook, which I will refer to as ILH through the remainder of this presentation. Mr. Jan Denij was the lead author for this chapter. He is the Chief of Planning and Natural Hazards Division at Technical Division for Water, Sea, and Waterways in the French Center for Studies and Expertise on Risk, Environment, Mobility, and Urban and Country Planning. In this short presentation, I will try to give you a flavor of the content of Chapter 3, which focuses on functions, forms, and failures of levees. It is one of the central chapters in terms of concepts used in the handbook. As you can see from the overall handbook summary, that Chapter 3, Functions, Forms, and Failures of Levees, is situated within the first of 4 categories, Fundamentals. Chapter 3 is preceded by a chapter entitled Understanding Levees, Basic Concepts, and followed by 3 chapters under the Managing Levees category, 2 chapters under Toolbox, and another 2 chapters under Making Changes. Chapter 3 introduces the form and function of levees and provides an understanding of failure mechanisms, building upon concepts outlined in Chapter 2. The chapter is divided into 5 separate sections, including Section 3.1, Functions of Levees, which introduces, defines, and describes levee functions within the overall context of a flood defense system. Although levees act as a water barrier, they are also used in a number of other ways, as you'll see on some of the next few slides. Within Section 3.1, the coordination of component functions and evolution of levees are also addressed. For Section 3.2, Functions and Forms of Levee Components, this area presents the various components that might comprise the levee structure. Their functions and main technical issues are also developed. Section 3.3, Forms of Levees, depicts various types of levees through schematics, including typical cross-sections. Section 3.4, Structures associated with levees, describes complementing appurtenant levee structures along with their function and effect on the flood defense system. And finally, Section 3.5, Understanding Failures of Levees, discusses failure modes and introduces breach, damage, and deterioration of levee components and segments linked to failure of levee or levee systems. The following is an overview of what you will find in Section 3.1, Functions of Levees. This section within Chapter 3 of the ILH deals with 4 main topics: functions and types of levees within the overall flood defense system, the multifunctional role of levees in addition to flood risk reduction, the environment of levees highlighting primary loading conditions, morphology and evolution of the different levee environments, and climatic change effects. Also within this section, you'll see the historical evolution of levees, highlighting changes over time in the levee system, changes in conditions and areas surrounding levees, and the necessary coordination of levee functions through time. This illustration is courtesy of Reinhard Pohl from the University of Dresden in Germany, and it depicts the association or transition from a riverine environment to an estuary to a coastal environment, with various features used for flood risk reduction. Levees are often a principal component of a flood defense system. However, the system is an association of components that work together to reduce the risk of inundation for a designated area, for instance, this leveed area that you see here. It may therefore include man-made or natural structures such as flood walls, I can get my cursor here, flood walls, pump stations, drainage pipes, gates, sluice gates, or other coastal features, as you can see here. Levees are included in the flood defense system, which is the main structural part of the overall flood risk management system. They have 3 main hydraulic functions to perform: to retain, to channel, or to control the release of water. As you can see from the diagram on the right, the flood defense system is part of the overall flood risk management system that must include other elements such as planning policy, emergency planning, communication, and forecast and alert in order to be complete and to perform well. Inside the flood defense system, the levee is the main component, but the flood defense system also must rely on other appurtenant structures such as sluices, gates, spillways, or pumping stations to perform and manage the hydraulic phenomena. Finally, the levee itself is a subsystem that has a specific hydraulic function assumed by a specific structure composed by form and various components. This schematic shows how the levee itself and the accompanying components fit into the flood defense system and also into the overall flood risk management system. Section 3.2, Form and Functions of Levee Components, focus on the definition of the levee component and the functions that the components must perform in order to ensure the reliability of the levee. The identification of several main components of the levee in terms of their geometric and technical description, the specific associated functions of each, and the main technical issues and associated methods. Also outlined in this section is the combination of components working collectively for the integrity of the levee, as well as the relationships between components and functions, which are summarized within the section of the ILH. Features depicted on this typical cross-section of the levee include waterside revetments, or hard armoring in some cases that's termed, an impermeable core with filter layers, earth and fill material, and in some cases there may be waterside or landside berms, or a tow drain system with a collector and discharge trench that you can see over here to the right. But note here that the discharge trench penetrates only into the impermeable soil foundation, not into the permeable soil foundation beneath. A different type of feature would be used here if a lot of flow is expected to come out of the underlying pervious layer. On this side, we have depicted through a Venn diagram how the hydraulic functionality and the structure come together to achieve protection against external erosion, internal erosion, levee instability, and to ensure impermeability as well as appropriate drainage and filtration. Several structural functions must be ensured by individual components. However, the functionality is most often accomplished by several components working together than by one single component acting on its own. This slide gives an example, and it's abbreviated, of a description of a levee component. In this case, it's a revetment, and it's illustrated by this simple schematic at the bottom. The excerpt within the handbook will first provide a comprehensive description of the feature or the component. So in this case, the revetment acts at the interface between the external environment and the levee, both on the water side and the land side slopes, and also on the crest. Sometimes termed revetment or armoring, the waterside slope protection is often constructed as added insurance for the levee stability to resist erosive properties. Constituents or the composition of the revetment typically consists of grass, riprap, asphalt, geotextiles, or cellular confinement systems. However, there are a number of other materials that might be used. The handbook then details the intended functions of the component. In this case, for a revetment, on the water side, it is constructed to protect the levee from external or surface erosion caused by currents and wave action. In a coastal environment, roughness elements or slopes partly covered by rock are often used to increase the surface roughness and to reduce wave run-up heights and wave overtopping rates. On the crest and the landside slope, a revetment may be constructed to protect against erosion from surface runoff and other non-hydraulic agents, and eventually to protect against erosion due to overtopping and overflowing, especially for a coastal or submersible levee. There are also technical issues addressed in the ILH specific to the component, such as the appropriateness of the revetment type or material composition, weaknesses of transition areas, and aesthetic and environmental considerations. In this section, the different types and forms of levees are presented. The typology that has been defined and used comprises an earth-fill levee, including homogeneous levees or zoned levees, composite levees, including superstructures, structures on the water side, structures inside, or alternative structures, and then historical levees as shown in the photo on this slide. For each of these levee types, a general definition is given, the main components and schematics of a typical cross-section are presented, and technical issues are discussed. Examples of earth and composite levees are included in a few of the following slides. So it's a continuation of section 3.3, forms of levees. These are some samples from the handbook of a zoned levee. A section within the handbook such as this would begin with a description, as in this example for a zoned levee, and general considerations one should take into account. So a zoned levee's cross-section is comprised of a combination of permeable and relatively impermeable materials. There are two primary types of zoned levees, those with an impermeable core or an impermeable mask, and this is followed by main components of the form and typical cross-sections as shown here. Some of the main components of a zoned levee include a core or mask for impermeability and earth fill for stability. Some of the technical issues might consist of seepage control to prevent uplift pressures and piping or internal erosion through the foundation, filter layers to prevent the migration of fines, and an external protection to prevent deterioration from external agents. The graphics depict various different zoned levees, from one of the homogeneous foundation, sand fill, and clay cap, the one at the top, to one with a permeable soil foundation layer beneath an impermeable soil foundation, permeable earth fill with waterside and landside berms, to yet another variation including an impermeable core. Section 3.4 of the ILH deals with appurtenant structures that are associated with levees. Each structure is defined and described according to its function or impact on the flood defense system. Typical sketches and illustrations of various structures are presented, and a distinction is made between structures that are linked and specially designed for flood risk reduction and structures that are not. The importance of transition zones with natural or human-made structures within the line of defense is also addressed in this section. An example of content within section 3.4 of the handbook is under spillways and floodways, which again includes first a definition. The spillway is a structure designed to provide a controlled release of water from one area to another, either over the structure or through it, and most often spillways release floods to prevent overflow or damage to the levee, as with a dam. It can be categorized as either a controlled spillway, mechanical, or an uncontrolled spillway, geometrical. The floodway is reserved property set aside to divert floodwaters from a river channel or watercourse. The function of the component within the flood defense system is then discussed, and for a spillway there are two types depending on the downstream area objective. A safety spillway, which is a structure that discharges in a leveed area and protects the levee from failure under excessive water levels, and a diversion spillway, which is a structure that discharges in a flood detention area, a secondary river channel, or a designated floodway, and it also would divert part of the flood from the river channel in order to reduce the downstream water levels. Finally, this section addresses issues associated with the component. Highlighted spillway or floodway issues might include scour, resulting from high velocities during peak discharges at the water side or the landside toe, crest instability, resiliency of material components, development of property within the floodway, and consequently this could result in an increased population at risk, and human error in operating the floodway. Section 3.5 defines the levee failure and discusses the processes of levee failure. It provides definitions for levee deterioration, damage, breach, and failure, and this section outlines the link between the functions, the forms, and the failure. Within this section, the process of failure is described through elementary mechanisms and scenarios of events. Illustrations depicting the main physical processes of deterioration, damage, and breach are detailed, and they're grouped typically in these three categories of external erosion, internal erosion, and instability. Finally, statistics about levee failure resulting from an analysis of historical flooding events or an analysis of failure mechanisms is presented in the ILH. However, we won't go into a lot of detail during this short presentation in that regard. A structural failure scenario leads to a breach and consists of a process which involves both physical and functional phenomena affecting the levee segment. The components of the levee undergo mechanisms leading to deterioration and damage, and the function of the levee can degrade to ultimate failure or breach. A mechanism is a time-dependent physical process that affects the levee component and involves a decline in the state of its structural properties. It can result in the deterioration and damage of one or more physical levee components. Deterioration and damage can lead to a breach, which is a low crest situation or a significant hole in the defense system. Breach is an ultimate degradation of a hydraulic function of the levee or a paroxysmal state of levee failure resulting from a quick collapse of the levee structure. In the figure on the left, multiple sources may act singularly or in concert with one another to result in a hydraulic failure of the levee through overtopping or breach. These sources may include changes in the levee environment, operational failure, poor design, or structural issues, and can be further categorized as either hydraulic failure with or without damage. The figure on the right displays both hydraulic and structural failure of the levee, which results in inundation of the leveed area, where the hydraulic failure is essentially overtopping or exceeding the planned level of protection, and the structural failure occurs when an element of the levee sustains damage to the point that the levee breaches. The combination of events affecting a particular levee depend on its form, components, the associated structures, and the loads and evolution of loads which affect it over time. The appearance of a mechanism can be activated by a phenomenon initiator such as an overload, a high water level, or a rapid change in water level, excessive seepage, or an abnormally raised flow of water. Component deterioration or damage results in the degradation or failure of one or more functions associated with the components. Degradation or failure of a function can then initiate or aggravate mechanisms, creating a new elementary chain of events. So the graphic on this slide is an example of a scenario or chain of events leading to structural levee failure and eventually breach. And in many cases, these scenarios can be quite complex. For this particular example, the left portion of the diagram starts with an external action, and that's an external initiating factor that then triggers mechanisms which cause deterioration or damage of the components. And degradation or failure of functions. And note that the elementary chain of events in this left diagram may reoccur many times before there is an extensive damage which eventually causes breach. Also note that one mechanism of deterioration and damage acting on one component of the levee can also trigger another mechanism in what we would term a domino effect, while two different mechanisms could also develop in parallel. In the more case-specific example on the right, we have a situation where the floodwaters are below the levee crest, but the external erosion of the waterside clay surface is occurring to the point where the clay surface has started to erode away. Can't see my cursor, so I'm just going to put it down to the right, thereby losing the impermeability function. So with further external actions occurring, there's backward erosion that begins and a pipe or cavity is formed in the embankment. The stability of the embankment is threatened, and the embankment then collapses, resulting in total ruin of the embankment or breach. Continuing with section 3.5, this slide provides an excerpt on the main processes of deterioration, damage, and breach by showing an internal erosion example. First, obviously in other sections, a definition is provided. For internal erosion, Soil particles within the levee or its foundation are carried downstream by seepage flow, and it's initiated by hydrodynamic forces acting on soil particles inside or even through the body of the levee. The definition is followed by a list of factors contributing to the failure, whether they are initiating, continuing, or aggravating factors for seepage. They're related to the presence of permeable layers or lenses or the existence of cracks or fine fissures within the fill. Animal activities with the uncontrolled development of burrows or vegetation with the uncontrolled development of roots, and human activity with pipes or other penetrating structures through the levee. Finally, different mechanisms have been described and depicted with illustrations. For internal erosion, various principles include backward erosion, concentrated erosion, contact erosion, and subfusion. Presented in these three typical sketches pertaining to internal erosion affecting the levee, including the internal erosion of the body along a penetrating structure or of the foundation soils. This example can be found in section 3.5.2, main processes of deterioration, damage, and breach. The next two slides present other examples within section 3.5, external erosion. As previously shown with internal erosion, the section begins with a definition, followed by factors affecting the external erosion, and concluding with different types of mechanisms. The images on this slide depict external erosion caused by the action of waves, currents, or turbulence within a channel. Additionally, the images reflect external erosion due to a lateral movement or meandering of a flow that can undermine the levee, leading to deep and/or shallow slope instability or bank caving, as well as direct erosion. These images are a continuation of the mechanisms of external erosion, where you have unexpected overtopping of a levee shown in the top two sketches and overflowing of a levee shown in the bottom two that can induce major damages linked to surface erosion. The shock and velocity of the flows induce a wearing away of the material of the levee, and this causes scour and erosion to develop on the crest or on the landward side of the levee when the water passes. The next two slides show an example of instability found also in section 3.5, understanding failure of levees. The same structure continues for this section, including a definition where you have active strengths of the soil particle movement exceeding resistant strengths, excessive loads on the levee or weak physical properties of the levee materials or foundation soils may also generate sliding along a shear surface within the levee embankment and or foundation soils that damage the levee. Factors also contribute to instability, including weight, which is a primary factor of instability since it's the main driving force of soil particle movement. The levee soil might become saturated during high water and cannot drain as fast as the water recedes. This causes an increased weight in the levee embankment and ultimately slope failure. There's also a decline in the properties of the fill body or of the foundation soil that could reduce the shear strength and therefore the resistance to the levee sliding. And other factors of instability include human activities, animal burrowing, impacts, specific physical impacts, seismic activity, or erosion. And then we have a few examples of instability mechanisms that are presented. The first two sketches depict shallow rotational sliding or creeping of both the land side and the water side of the levee. Clayey materials that make up the levee will, over time, become weathered and potentially soften from the surface down. This effect will be aggravated by seasonal variations. For example, sometimes the soils in the summer crack and cause a pathway for water in the winter months to infiltrate. This softening will weaken the slopes of an embankment, leading to sliding or creeping. These next images are a continuation of the mechanisms for instability. Translational sliding, shown in the top two images, which is when the presence of a very weak surface layer of peats and clays in the foundation or body of the levee results in a horizontal block movement of an embankment. There's also consolidation, settlement, or also tilting shown in these other images. Levees are typically constructed, of course, in floodplains with foundations that contain layers of soft clays and peat. These materials tend to undergo relatively large, time-dependent settlement as they consolidate under an imposed load. Differential settlement in the foundation soils or in the body of the levee can also induce a tilting of the walls that are part of the structure of the levee. And the last schematic on this slide represents uplift, instability. An increase in the pore pressure of a permeable layer underlying a thin impermeable layer can trigger an uplift of the cover layer and a deep sliding of the land side of the levee, similar to the mechanism of liquefaction. In conclusion, Chapter 3 covers three main topics: functions, forms, and failure of levees. It's important to note that each of these topics is codependent on the other within the levee system as a whole, forming a cycle which is depicted in this schematic. Levee functions are ensured through a specific form or structure. Possible modes of failure are inherently dependent of the levee functions, and types of damage and deterioration are dependent upon levee forms. Chapter 3 is particularly important since succeeding chapters in the handbook draw upon these fundamentals of levee form, function, and failure. So Jan and I were very fortunate to have contributions from a number of individuals from all the participating countries, and we're very appreciative of their input. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. I hope it's given you a flavor of the content in Chapter 3 and encourages you to investigate the other chapters of the International Levee Handbook, which have similar presentations. The complete handbook can be downloaded from the CIRIA website, the link to which is given on the current slide. Thank you.